Awaken your shadow. The truth sets some people free. It offends everyone else. By Seth, the Red Neo, Cherupak.
Chapter 3, Part 2, New Levels, New Devils.
The great spiritual teachers throughout history understood something profound that modern science is only beginning to explore. Consciousness evolves through distinct levels, each bringing its own opportunities and temptations. While many teachers and traditions offer intricate models of this process, I've found that spiritual growth ascends through 3 levels. Think of how a child learns to walk. First, they must master physical balance. Then, they develop the emotional courage to venture forward. Finally, they gain the wisdom to know where they're going. Spiritual growth follows a similar process. 3 distinct levels, each with its own temptations and opportunities. This is my model for understanding the path of awakening, and it draws on fascinating scientific insights. Dr. Roland Griffiths' groundbreaking studies at Johns Hopkins shed light on how altered states of consciousness correspond to developmental changes in the brain. Griffiths' work with long-term meditators reveals distinct neurological patterns that support the idea of progressive levels in consciousness. Dr. Andrew Newberg's neurotheology research, as documented in How God Changes Your Brain, provides further evidence for this. His work demonstrates how spiritual practices like meditation and prayer reshape neural pathways, reducing fear-driven responses in the amygdala while enhancing areas tied to compassion and self-regulation. In Power versus Force, author Dr. David Hawkins introduced a map of consciousness, which charts levels of ascension based on his research. Hawkins's model provides a compelling lens through which to view my 3-level model of our spiritual journey. Level 1, physical survival, below 200 on Dr. Hawkins's scale. Level 2, emotional thriving, 200 to 500 on Dr. Hawkins's scale. Level 3, spiritual transcendence, 500 plus on Dr. Hawkins's scale. The journey through these levels requires us to confront and overcome the spiritual predators lurking at each stage. These devils are parasitic thought forms, energetic patterns that thrive on repression, fear, and desire. These patterns feed on the energy of our shadow selves, appealing to our unacknowledged fears and unmet needs, and using them to reinforce the very blocks we seek to transcend. Even Jesus faced these trials, offering us a powerful blueprint for understanding the challenges of growth. Jesus' first temptation was to use his divine power to turn stones into bread, a challenge tied to the basic human need to eat and survive. This temptation mirrors the devils of greed, lust, and sloth, the first 3 of the 7 deadly sins, urges that promote survival and reproduction. These sins call us to misuse divine energy to satisfy immediate material desires, sacrificing growth for convenience. When left unchecked, these forces enslave us to the physical level by trapping us in patterns of scarcity and the impulses of our unrefined shadow selves. Jesus' second temptation was to throw himself from the temple, testing whether God would save him. This speaks to emotional needs for validation, significance, and reassurance, needs that, when distorted, make us vulnerable to wrath, gluttony, and envy. This temptation reflects an impulse to prove that we are safe, important, or loved, exposing an absence of the faith and patience that come with emotional and spiritual maturity. The devils at this level exploit unintegrated shadow aspects tied to emotional wounds, creating self-sabotaging cycles of rage, indulgence, and comparison. Finally, at the spiritual level, Jesus was offered power over all the kingdoms of the world in exchange for worshiping Satan. This temptation reveals the danger of pride, the greatest of the 7 deadly sins. Here, the allure is to wield spiritual authority for domination rather than service, distorting divine power into a tool for control. These parasitic patterns promise elevation, but ultimately enslave us to the matrix, as pride blinds us to the divine truth of interconnectedness and humility. A modern parable of this dynamic is found in the Matrix trilogy. Neo's journey mirrors the temptations and trials we face at each level of spiritual growth. In the first movie, Neo must confront the illusion of the material world, the Matrix itself, and choose whether to sacrifice comfort for truth. Near the end of the movie, Neo battles doubt and fear, questioning his significance and abilities as the One. In the Matrix Revolutions, Neo faces the ultimate trial, self-sacrifice. By surrendering his ego and willingly giving himself over to a greater cause, Neo achieves a profound transformation. Neo's final act of self-sacrifice foreshadows the third and final spiritual awakening, a level of spiritual transcendence that requires the death of ego and the rebirth of self as a fully integrated and divine being. Like Neo, our growth depends on seeing through illusions, integrating our shadow selves and resisting the traps of the Matrix at each stage. Aragorn's journey in The Lord of the Rings exemplifies the transformation necessary to transcend this temptation. Born into the lineage of kings, Aragorn begins as a nomad, a ranger wandering the wilderness, avoiding his destiny and the weight of his birthright. In this survival phase, he grapples with fear and self-doubt, questioning his worthiness to claim the throne and his ability to rule without succumbing to the corrupting influence of power symbolized by the One Ring. Through his trials, Aragorn evolves into a leader, gradually stepping into his role as a protector and guide. At the emotional level, he learns to balance courage with compassion, earning the trust of those who follow him. Rather than seeking power, he prioritizes service to others, aligning his actions with the greater good of Middle-earth. Aragorn's ultimate transformation comes when he fully accepts his destiny as king. At the spiritual level, he overcomes the temptation of pride and ambition, embracing the throne not as a means to dominate, but as a responsibility to serve his people. This journey, from nomad to leader to king, demonstrates the essence of spiritual growth, integrating humility, courage, and service to transcend the traps of the Matrix and fulfill our highest purpose. These temptations warn us of the risks of bypassing the foundational work required at each level. When we pursue spiritual awakening without shadow work, we strengthen the very patterns we seek to overcome. Many spiritual seekers aim directly for enlightenment while ignoring the two awakenings that give us the power and wisdom to transcend the first two levels. These spiritual tourists want the crown without the cross, the fruit before the seed, and the glory at the expense of the growth. Jesus concludes the Sermon on the Mount with the parable of the wise and foolish builders, reminding us that the strength of any structure depends on its foundation. Building on sand leaves us vulnerable to collapse, while a foundation rooted in truth ensures resilience and growth. When we pursue spiritual awakening without spiritual growth, we leave gaps that weaken our spiritual architecture and make us vulnerable to possession by spiritual predators. The good news is that each awakening brings you closer to authentic power, not the brittle strength of ego, but the unshakable power that comes from integrating every aspect of your divine nature. As we confront and integrate these patterns, we reclaim the energy they once consumed. This transformation turns resistance into momentum as we activate and actualize the 7 aspects of our higher self. New subheader, Level 2, Emotional. You wake up and reach for your phone, scrolling through emails, texts, and notifications. A familiar twinge of restlessness surfaces. Not quite anxiety, but a nagging sense that you should be doing more, achieving more, becoming more. Compelled by this persistent feeling, you get started with your day. By mid-morning, you're deep in your routine, the projects are moving forward, the clients are satisfied, the numbers look good, yet there's a subtle undercurrent of dissatisfaction that you can't quite name. You find yourself checking social media between tasks, each scroll bringing a mix of inspiration and unease as you compare your progress to others in your field. At lunch with a friend, you notice yourself half listening to their stories, your mind drifting to unchecked boxes on your to-do list. When they share news about their engagement, You offer congratulations while battling an inexplicable mix of joy and emptiness. Later, you'll replay the conversation, wondering why you couldn't feel more present in what should have been a meaningful moment. The money's good, better than last year, but your savings aren't growing as fast as you'd hoped. You've made progress with budgeting and investing, but consistency remains elusive. Same with your health routine. Some weeks you hit the gym regularly and eat well, other weeks you barely make it once. The meditation practice that brought such clarity last month has slowly slipped away, replaced by checking email first thing in the morning. Your journal entries, once daily, have become sporadic notes of goals and plans yet to materialize. These cycles of progress and backsliding have become familiar companions. You're doing many things right, managing money better than before, taking care of your health more than you used to, working on your mental well-being. Yet somehow the momentum never quite builds the way you know it could. The urgent still tends to overshadow the important, and too many days end with good intentions deferred. Evening finds you unwinding with streaming TV or surfing the web, though unwinding might be generous. It's more like using the show to drown out the worry, doubt, overthinking, and anxiety being served up by your rational mind. Your business is growing, your relationships are stable, your routines are solid. Some days bring real victories and moments of genuine satisfaction. Other days, despite checking all the right boxes, you find yourself wondering why the success you're building doesn't feel more fulfilling, why connections that should be deepening sometimes feel like they're standing still. This is life at the emotional level, where our biggest battles aren't with external circumstances but with internal states. Here, achievement and emptiness often arrive as twins, and each step forward in one area of life can feel like a step backward in another. The same drive that fuels our success can leave us feeling disconnected from the people and experiences that matter most. Modern neuroscience reveals that emotions don't just influence our behavior, they create patterns that shape our entire reality. These patterns don't just affect our work performance or decision-making, they fundamentally alter how we experience relationships, joy, purpose, and meaning. When our emotional world remains unregulated, even our greatest achievements can feel empty, and our closest relationships can feel distant. This scientific understanding illuminates what spiritual traditions have long taught about the emotional realm. The book of Proverbs tells us to guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. 423. This isn't poetic metaphor. It's a practical truth about how emotional energy, when mismanaged, becomes the source of our greatest struggles, both in business and in life. While these challenges are also present at the survival level, they take center stage as soon as our first awakening lifts us to the emotional level. At this level, three spiritual predators work to corrupt our emotional needs into roller coaster patterns of dysregulation and self-sabotage. Wrath, which corrupts ambition into anger, gluttony, which corrupts emotional nourishment into overconsumption, and envy, which corrupts confidence into comparison. Each operates with subtle sophistication, making their influence hard to detect until we understand their true nature. Ancient wisdom traditions recognize these forces, and modern science now confirms their impact on our brain and nervous system. Devil 4. Azazel, the devil of wrath. Azazel, the ancient scapegoat demon mentioned in the book of Leviticus and later elaborated in the book of Enoch as one of the fallen watchers who taught mankind the arts of war and personal adornment, corrupts our natural drive for progress into anxious, fear-driven ambition. This doesn't immediately manifest as wrath. It begins as a constant, restless dissatisfaction with natural progress, or a compulsion to prove our worth through activity or achievement. Like water that's been heated just below boiling, this energy creates constant turbulence beneath a seemingly calm surface. When we meet these expectations and achieve something big, we're on top of the world. But when our expectations for progress go unmet, ambition turns to frustration. Frustration left unchecked breeds resentment. Resentment then corrupts into anger, which eventually erupts as wrath. Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett's research reveals how this pattern creates what she calls allostatic load, the physiological cost of constant striving. When we can't regulate our passion for progress, our nervous system stays locked in a state of perpetual activation. Dr. Robert Sapolsky's studies show how this chronic activation triggers a cascade of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline that rewire our brain's amygdala, heightening threat detection while dampening the prefrontal cortex. The result? A brain more prone to emotional volatility and less equipped to process challenges with patience and clarity. You might recognize this pattern in the entrepreneur who can't enjoy current success because they're already anxious about the next goal, the creative who keeps tweaking their work long after it's ready to launch, the professional who turns every project into an unnecessary emergency, the parent who pushes their children toward achievement at the cost of connection. These are all examples of unsustainable ambition. They're unsustainable not because the goals are too high, but because of our attachment to a perfect result coming along a predictable timeline of our choosing. When life doesn't cooperate, we have a choice. We can release our attachment so we can examine and refine our expectations, or we can demand that life meets our rigid expectations anyway. When we choose the latter, we cling to systemic fallacies, false beliefs about control and certainty that conflict with the basic laws of life. These fallacies corrupt both extrinsic and intrinsic evaluations, creating a tangled web of compulsive thoughts, actions, and distorted self-beliefs. This is how we become ideologically possessed by demons of confusion, frustration, impatience, and fear, the fear that the reward won't be worth our effort. Just as Azazel taught mankind the arts of weaponry and warfare in ancient times, this demon now weaponizes our own ambition against us, and the downward spiral toward wrath begins. The Bhagavad Gita warns explicitly about the high cost of wrath. From anger comes delusion, and from delusion loss of memory. From loss of memory comes the ruin of understanding, and from the ruin of understanding he perishes. The New Testament book of James illuminates the root of this corruption. What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire but do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. 4:1-2. This underscores how unregulated ambition degenerates into destructive anger. Verses 22 of the Buddhist Dhammapada gives us a timeless warning about anger and our ability to control our actions in life. He who restrains his rising anger as a skillful charioteer checks a speeding chariot. Him I call a true charioteer. Other charioteers only hold the reins. Ancient wisdom and modern neuroscience converge on this profound psychological truth. The very achievements we gain through ambition become poisoned by the anger born from that same ambition. Like a person climbing a ladder only to saw off the rungs beneath them, we destroy through anger what we built through effort. Modern neuroscience confirms this pattern. Chronic anger creates persistent dysregulation in the brain's limbic system, particularly the amygdala, which becomes hypersensitive to perceived threats. This impairs the prefrontal cortex, the seat of focus, decision-making, and emotional regulation. The cycle of anger erodes the very mental tools that enable progress. For instance, studies at the University of California found that individuals with high levels of chronic anger showed a 25% decrease in activity in their ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the brain region linked to long-term planning and impulse control. This biological shift leads to a loss of patience, perspective, and the ability to recover after setbacks. Entrepreneurs experiencing this may obsess over minor failures, creatives may abandon projects out of frustration, and leaders may alienate their teams with outbursts or micromanagement. Over time, these patterns deplete our energy and erode the connections that sustain growth. Wrath ultimately isolates us from ourselves, others, and the divine. Devil 5, Beelzebub, the devil of gluttony. Beelzebub, known as the Lord of the Flies, corrupts our natural need for connection and significance into compulsive consumption. Unlike physical hunger, emotional gluttony operates through sophisticated mechanisms, transforming our deep needs for connection, impact, and significance into an insatiable appetite for external validation and experience seeking. This devil feeds on our unmet emotional needs, creating cycles where we attempt to fill soul-deep yearnings with surface-level satisfactions. Modern gluttony manifests wherever we try to fill emotional voids with consumption, accumulating social media followers to feel significant, binge-watching shows to simulate connection, compulsively shopping for the temporary high of acquisition, or overindulging in food to soothe feelings of emptiness. These behaviors offer a fleeting sense of fullness, but leave us feeling more hollow than before. Beelzebub thrives in environments where deeper emotional needs go unrecognized. Someone longing for real connection might constantly seek new experiences or relationships without ever going deep. Another might try to fill their need for impact and significance through endless acquisition of status symbols. The result is an emotional life that feels simultaneously overstuffed and utterly empty. Jesus addressed this in John 6:27, saying, "Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life." This speaks to the deeper truth about overindulgence. No amount of consumption can satisfy our need for authentic connection, genuine impact, and true significance. The key to mastering gluttony lies in recognizing what we're really hungry for, not more experiences or possessions, but the deep nourishment that comes from living in alignment with our authentic emotional needs. Devil 6, Leviathan, the devil of envy. Leviathan corrupts our natural need for personal validation into bitter comparison and chronic dissatisfaction. Unlike its Hollywood portrayal as simple jealousy, envy operates through sophisticated self-deception. It transforms our healthy desire to grow into an obsessive need to measure our progress against others, creating a perpetual sense of falling behind regardless of our actual achievements. The path from confidence to envy follows a predictable pattern. When our need for validation goes unmet, confidence turns to insecurity. Insecurity, left unchecked, breeds comparison. Comparison then corrupts into envy, which eventually manifests as arrogance, resentment, or revenge-seeking. The book of Ecclesiastes captures this progression perfectly. Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. 4:4. This spiritual truth aligns seamlessly with modern neuroscience. Dr. Joseph Guarino's research reveals how this pattern creates what neuroscientists call a social threat response. When we constantly compare ourselves to others, our brain's threat detection system treats every perceived shortfall as a survival threat. Dr. Matthew Lieberman's studies on social pain and reward circuits show how this triggers a cascade of hormonal responses, primarily cortisol and dopamine, that rewire our neural reward pathways. This rewiring makes us increasingly dependent on external validation while dulling our ability to find fulfillment in authentic achievements. You might recognize this pattern in the business owner who can't celebrate wins because competitors seem to be growing faster, the creator who constantly refreshes their stats instead of focusing on their craft, the professional who chases titles and status rather than meaningful impact, the person who turns every friendship into a subtle competition. These are all examples of false confidence. When we fail, or someone close to us succeeds beyond our expectations, we have a choice. We can examine and refine our source of self-worth, the intrinsic dimension, or we can continue to seek and demand validation from external sources. When we choose the latter, we attach ourselves to systemic fallacies that deny and devalue our authentic nature. These systemic fallacies corrupt both our extrinsic and intrinsic evaluations, distorting our self-concept and our corresponding actions. Leviathan senses this spiritual wound, and the downward spiral toward envy begins. The Bhagavad Gita warns explicitly of this trap in chapter 16, verses 13 to 15. This wealth is mine now, and more will be mine later. These enemies I have killed, and more I shall kill. I am the Lord, I am the enjoyer, I am successful, powerful, and happy. I am rich and well-born. Who else is equal to me? The New Testament book of James reinforces this warning, saying, "Where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice." 3:16. This isn't just ancient wisdom, it's a precise description of how unregulated confidence transforms into destructive comparison. The Dhammapada in verses 365 to 366 offers both a warning and a path to freedom. One should not despise what one has received, nor should one envy others. A monk who envies others does not achieve meditation. If one has little but does not despise what one has received, leading a pure life and being energetic, the gods praise such a one. This ancient wisdom reveals a profound psychological truth. The very recognition we seek through comparison becomes poisoned by the envy born from that same comparison. Like a person staring so hard at another's path that they stumble on their own, we sabotage through envy what we could build through authentic self-expression. Chronic comparison impairs the brain regions responsible for self-awareness and authenticity, particularly the anterior cingulate cortex ACC and medial prefrontal cortex MPFC. Studies from the University of Cambridge show that frequent upward social comparisons, such as scrolling through curated social media feeds, lead to heightened activity in the brain's default mode network. This network becomes hyper-focused on self-referential thinking, increasing feelings of inadequacy while suppressing our ability to recognize and celebrate our unique strengths. This neurological shift creates a cycle of dissatisfaction. The harder we strive for external recognition, the more disconnected we become from the authentic self that would naturally attract it. Leviathan thrives in this gap, feeding on our unresolved insecurities and redirecting our creative potential toward fruitless comparisons instead of genuine growth. This temptation manifests through the three devils of this level. In wrath, we test God by demanding life bend to our timeline. In gluttony, we test him by expecting divine intervention without our participation. In envy, we test him by comparing our spiritual gifts to others. Mastering the emotional level is no small feat. The spiritual predators that operate here, wrath, gluttony, and envy, don't just challenge us. They seduce us with sophisticated promises that feel true but lead to spiritual bondage. Wrath offers the thrill of progress but leaves destruction in its wake. Envy promises recognition but corrodes authentic achievement. Sloth whispers of safety but delivers stagnation. Each pattern feeds into the others, forming an intricate web of emotional traps that keeps us disconnected from our higher self. For example, the frustration of wrath can drive us to compare ourselves to others, fueling envy. When envy overwhelms us, sloth creeps in, whispering that avoiding the struggle altogether will protect us from further pain. Together they create a vicious cycle that drains our emotional energy and sabotages our growth. Liberation from these patterns comes through integration, not combat. When we understand how these spiritual predators corrupt our value intelligence, distorting our systemic understanding, sabotaging our extrinsic choices, and eroding our intrinsic sense of worth, we can begin the work of transmuting their energy into mature expression. The power that feeds wrath becomes focused ambition. The energy behind envy transforms into authentic confidence. The force driving sloth evolves into grounded stability. This is the promise of what psychologists call emotional regulation. We master our emotions not by overcoming them, but through alchemical transformation, where our feelings become allies rather than our saboteurs. Dr. Barbara Fredrickson's research reveals that proper emotional regulation creates what she calls an upward spiral, where balanced emotional states enhance our capacity for growth, connection, and resilience. Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett's work shows how emotional granularity, the ability to recognize and work with subtle emotional states, literally rewires our brain's regulatory systems, creating new pathways for mature emotional expression. The emotional level serves as a crucial bridge between physical survival and spiritual transcendence. The devils here aren't just obstacles, they're opportunities to transmute raw emotional energy into spiritual power. With each integration, we reclaim the energy these spiritual predators once consumed. What lies beyond this emotional battlefield? That's where shadow work reveals its deepest magic, transforming our greatest struggles into our most profound strengths and victories. New subheader, Level 3, Spiritual. You sit in a state of tranquil meditation, content with your present, at peace with your past, and clear about your purpose. The physical world no longer enslaves you. Your emotions no longer rule you. You've tamed desire, mastered your impulses, and found inner peace and balance. A subtle pride emerges, not in what you've achieved, but in who you've become. This, you think, is what enlightenment feels like. Then a client shares how your work changed their life. A student calls you their guru. A follower claims you are their spiritual guide. Each recognition feels right, deserved. After all, haven't you done the work? Haven't you earned this wisdom? The validation feeds something in you, not ego, surely. This is about impact, about service. Isn't it? That's the story your left brain tells you. Yet beneath this certainty lurks the most sophisticated devil of all. Known as the light bearer, Lucifer does not appear with horns and a pitchfork. He comes as a beautiful messenger of light and love. Just as Paul warned in 2 Corinthians 11:14-15, spiritual predators often masquerade as benevolent figures. Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. It is not surprising, then, if his servants also masquerade as servants of righteousness. Beneath this facade of beauty and love, Lucifer conceals the deadly, double-edged blade of the sin of pride. Christ's third temptation in the wilderness was a perfect example of the magnetic power of this sin. Satan showed Jesus all the kingdoms of the world and promised to give them to him in exchange for worship. This was not just a test of ambition or greed, but a profound spiritual challenge. The offer was for Jesus to claim earthly power and status without the humility of surrender to God's will. Jesus rejected this temptation with the words, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, 'Worship the Lord your God and serve him only.'" Here Jesus demonstrated the ultimate measure of spiritual maturity. It is not about wielding power or seeking recognition. It is about surrender, total alignment with God's will. Only in this surrender can one discern the difference between truth and deception. This same test awaits anyone who ascends to the spiritual level. The temptation is subtle but insidious, to claim enlightenment through achievement or self-admiration rather than through alignment with divine will. Devil 7, Lucifer, the devil of pride. Lucifer, from the Latin lux fere, meaning light-bearer or morning star, was not originally the name of a devil, but a symbol of brilliance, elevation, and splendor. In Isaiah 14, this image is used poetically to describe the fall of a proud earthly king, a common ancient metaphor equating rulers with stars cast down from the heavens. Over time, this image became the most precise symbol for the most dangerous spiritual failure of all, mistaking reflected light for its source. The word Satan, by contrast, comes from the Hebrew shaitan, meaning adversary or accuser. It describes a function, not a personal name, an opposing force that resists, tests, and exposes. In ancient Jewish texts, early Christian writings, and classical demonology, Satan and Lucifer were not originally understood as the same figure. Satan represents opposition and accusation. Lucifer represents exaltation corrupted by pride. Only later theological synthesis collapsed these distinct symbols into a single being. This collapse has come at a great cost. When Lucifer and Satan are treated as interchangeable, modern Christians and spiritual seekers alike are trained to look for evil only in obvious darkness: fear, hatred, violence, temptation, and vice. They become vigilant against corruption that feels threatening, while remaining blind to corruption that feels enlightening. In doing so, they guard themselves against Satan while leaving the door wide open to Lucifer. Satan tempts through resistance and fear. Lucifer seduces through beauty, insight, and apparent awakening. Satan says, "You are weak." Lucifer whispers, "You are chosen." This confusion dulls discernment at its most critical edge. When all evil is imagined as crude, grotesque, or hostile, false light goes unquestioned. Charisma is mistaken for authority. Spiritual bypassing is confused with wisdom and maturity. Spiritual experiences are assumed to be benevolent simply because they feel elevated. Pride passes undetected because it no longer looks like arrogance. It looks like enlightenment. This is precisely why Paul warned that Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. 2 Corinthians 11:14. The greatest danger is not darkness pretending to be light, but light convincing you that it belongs to you. Lucifer's domain is not ignorance, it is spiritual pride. His brilliance lies in dressing self-exaltation as awakening, persuading us that our authority is justified because it wears the language of wisdom, service, or love. He does not deny God outright. He subtly replaces God with the self. This is the final temptation of the spiritual path, not the rejection of truth, but its misappropriation, not rebellion, but ascension without surrender, not the absence of light, but the awareness of the true source of light. As Jesus showed, true spiritual power requires worshiping and serving God, not grasping for divine authority or seeking glory for ourselves. Lucifer's deceptions are so masterful that he once led 1/3 of heaven's angels astray. At the spiritual level, the sin of pride wears two faces, passive pride and aggressive pride. Passive pride, the sin of Narcissus. Passive pride hides behind the mask of false humility. The ancient Greek myth of Narcissus tells its story with brutal clarity, but popular retellings flatten its meaning. In the story, Narcissus is born under a prophecy that he will live a long life so long as he never comes to know himself. As he grows, his beauty draws admiration and desire, but he rejects anyone who loves him. The nymph Echo falls for him, and when she reaches out, he humiliates her and drives her away. Echo wastes away until only her voice remains. Others suffer the same rejection and call out for justice. Nemesis hears them and leads Narcissus to a clear pool of water. When he bends down to drink, he sees a face reflected in the surface and falls in love with it. He does not recognize it as his own reflection. He speaks to it, reaches for it, tries to touch it, but the image vanishes each time the water moves. Narcissus cannot leave the pool. He remains there, transfixed, refusing food and rest, until he wastes away and dies. When others come to retrieve his body, they find only a flower growing where he lay. The deeper meaning only reveals itself when we put away the popular interpretation and see ourselves in this story. Narcissus does not perish because he loves himself too much. He perishes because he cannot love himself directly. He can only approach himself through reflection, through appearance, distance, and image. He has to go to the river. He has to see himself reflected back. His sense of worth does not arise internally. It depends on what he can observe, admire, and confirm through an external image. His devotion does not belong to his being, but to his appearance. When the image vanishes, so does his sense of self. This story defines the sin of passive pride. Passive pride does not rest in intrinsic worth. It demands evidence. It does not embody self-worth. It constantly measures and remeasures it. It calls this humility, but it keeps the self locked in inspection, waiting for a reflection, approval, performance, identity, insight, to grant permission to exist. The self never receives love directly. It only earns tolerance when it looks a certain way. Growth collapses into endless observation without embodiment, awareness without action, insight without incarnation. Like Narcissus at the water's edge, passive pride leaves you staring inward forever, waiting for a reflection that finally feels worthy, while life passes untouched around you. Aggressive pride, the sin of Icarus. Aggressive pride wears the mask of transcendence. The ancient Greek myth of Icarus tells its story with equal clarity, though popular retellings distort its warning. In the story, Icarus escapes imprisonment with his father, Daedalus, who fashions wings from feathers and wax so they can flee the island of Crete. Before they take flight, Daedalus gives a clear command: fly neither too low nor too high. The sea will drag you down. The sun will destroy you. At first, Icarus obeys. He rises into the air and experiences freedom no human has ever known. He flies, he soars, he feels the miracle of ascent, but flight no longer satisfies him. The sky does not feel high enough. He wants more. He climbs higher, drawn upward by the brilliance of the sun. The wax softens. The wings unravel. Icarus falls from the sky and drowns in the sea below. Icarus does not perish because he dared to fly. Flight was never the failure, flight was the gift. He perishes because ascent awakens hunger. What begins as freedom turns into ambition. What begins as movement turns into entitlement. Icarus stops flying with the gift and tries to rise above its source. He does not seek alignment or obedience. He seeks supremacy. The sky no longer satisfies him. He has to reach the sun. This story defines aggressive pride. Aggressive pride does not reject growth, it weaponizes it. It mistakes altitude for authority, expansion for entitlement, and spiritual achievement for divine sanction. The self no longer seeks union, it seeks exaltation. It claims elevation as proof of worth and proximity to power as proof of truth. Like wax wings drawn toward fire, this pride cannot survive the presence of what it tries to possess. Icarus does not fall because he flies too high. He falls because he confuses ascent with arrival and radiance with source. The combined weight of spiritual pride. These two faces of pride seem like opposites to the casual observer, but they share the same root, self-focus distorted by external reference. Narcissus could not love himself without a mirror. Icarus could not remain faithful to flight once it awakened the desire for the sun. One collapses inward seeking a reflection, the other ascends upward seeking a crown. Both abandon alignment in favor of self-measurement. Passive pride whispers that you are not enough, and that only your achievements can give you a sense of self-worth. Aggressive pride whispers that you've earned your place among the spiritual elite, and that your achievements justify your sense of superiority or entitlement. Both forms of pride draw attention inward, away from the divine. This is how pride corrupts your systemic, extrinsic, and intrinsic evaluations and distorts your perception of spiritual maturity. Passive pride mistakes inadequacy for humility, while aggressive pride mistakes confidence for enlightenment. Both create a false sense of separation, either by paralyzing you with feelings of unworthiness or by inflating you with self-importance. True spiritual alignment, however, isn't about either weakness or strength. It's about surrendering the self entirely and turning toward divine truth. Only when pride is tamed can true discernment emerge. Discernment, the ability to distinguish truth from deception, isn't the cause of spiritual maturity. It's the effect of releasing self-focus and aligning with divine principles. Without mastering pride, discernment is clouded by personal biases and blind spots. When pride governs, even spiritual power or knowledge can lead to delusion. This is why so many fall prey to common misconceptions, such as believing that all spiritual experiences are benevolent without questioning their source, mistaking charisma or personality for true spiritual authority, equating spiritual knowledge or power with spiritual maturity. Discernment, as Jesus taught, comes from living in alignment with divine truth. The kingdom of heaven is within you, Luke 17:21, reminds us that spiritual enlightenment is not about escape, superiority, or self-focus. It is about embodying truth, serving others, and becoming a vessel for divine purpose. This principle is echoed across ancient wisdom and even validated by modern psychology. Dr. Robert Lifton's research on ideological totalism describes how spiritual pride leads to cognitive distortions. Lifton coined the term dispensed enlightenment to describe a state in which individuals believe they've transcended human growth and accountability, mistaking their spiritual experiences for maturity. This delusion, born of pride, severs the connection to true growth and alignment. The Upanishads warn of the same dual corruption, saying, those who worship avidya, material knowledge, enter into blind darkness. Those who worship vidya, spiritual knowledge, enter, as it were, into greater darkness. Here we see that even the pursuit of spiritual knowledge leads to greater darkness than the pursuit of material knowledge. This reflects the dangers of both passive and aggressive pride, the darkness of inadequacy and paralysis, and the blindness of ambition and self-aggrandizement. Similarly, the Diamond Sutra teaches, all appearances are illusive. If you see that all appearances are not appearances, you will then see the Tathagata. In the Diamond Sutra, the word Tathagata does not refer to a person, a god, or a higher spiritual identity. It means thus gone, or thus come, pointing to reality as it is, prior to all images, roles, and achievements. When the sutra says that seeing through appearances reveals the Tathagata, it is not describing the perception of a hidden being, but the collapse of illusion itself. What remains when appearances are no longer mistaken for truth is not something you attain or admire. It is what has always been present once self-focus dissolves. This is why both passive and aggressive pride miss the mark. One clings to reflections of inadequacy, the other to visions of achievement, while the divine is found only in surrender, alignment, and service beyond the mirror altogether. Lucifer's brilliance lies in disguising pride as spiritual progress. Passive pride masquerades as humility. Aggressive pride poses as confidence. Both keep the self at the center, perpetuating the illusion of separation from the divine. True spiritual growth requires stepping outside this illusion altogether. It is not enough to fixate on weaknesses like Narcissus or soar on strengths like Icarus. Both paths lead to ruin. In chapter 11 of this book, you'll find a raw confession of what this type of pride has done to me and the relationships that I failed to hold on to. Yes, I've made bad choices in who to partner with, as you've read in my personal stories. But I've also lived and loved long enough to know that the common thread in all our failed relationships is us. This is as true for me as it is for anyone else. My greatest personal battle has been with the sin of self-righteousness, the striving for moral perfection, and the demand of it from those closest to me. Self-righteousness breaks those around you under the weight of your unrealistic expectations. It leaves alone again and again to face your own shadow until you trade your crude crown of perfectionism for the crown of authenticity and grace. I will explain this in more detail in chapter 11, hoping that you can learn from the choices that robbed me of decades of happiness. The antidote to pride is complete surrender, emptying oneself of ego and becoming a vessel for divine will. From this surrender flow humility, fearlessness, and spiritual discernment. Contrary to common belief, humility isn't about thinking lowly of yourself. That is the most slippery form of pride, because it focuses on your own shortcomings rather than the power of the divine expressing itself through you. When all self-focus is removed, clarity emerges. Discernment becomes your natural mode of being. This is the alchemy that transforms the low-vibration energy of pride into the pure spiritual gold of enlightenment. This is how we completely transcend the limitations of our ego, awaken our higher self, and align with the sacred.
End of Part 2 of Chapter 3 of Awaken Your Shadow by Seth Cherapak.